Good morning. My name is Richard Parry. I'm the Director of Glasgow International, and I'm delighted to be here today with four very special panellists. Ned McConnell of the Roberts Institute of Art, Lauren A. Wright, curator, and the artists Zinzi Minott and Paul Maheke, and we'll give some more introductions to those individuals later. This is the first event of the Performance Research Network, as it's not really been called, but it kind of has been temporarily called in draft form. And this is a new initiative, really, which we hope to develop, that's come about between three festivals who each work in performance in different ways, or who have an element of that in their programs in the past. So this is so the aim of the Performance Research Network is to further discourse around how performance practices are presented and sustainably supported. It's been initiated by Block University, based in London, in partnership with ourselves, Glasgow International, and Liverpool Biennial. And the idea is that it's a curatorial-led and process-orientated research network, and we're aiming to kind of advance ourselves in this, and the sort of ideas around exploring models of co-commissioning and live events, and how we can sustainably support practices with stakeholders and other partners as well. I should mention that this event is very kindly supported by the Art Fund and the initiative as well about Performance Research Network. It really is embryonic, so we are going to see where it goes, but this feels like a very particularly important conversation to have now. Performance has been one of the things that has probably suffered most in the past year with the pandemic, and we as a festival have had to about turn on a number of things where performance has been involved, but we do have some performance. We're very excited about that, including a wonderful performance by Paul right on Thursday the 10th to kick things off. So I'm going to just introduce the panelists a little bit more. So we have Paul Maheke, who's an artist, lives in London, and after studying in Paris and Open School East, Paul's works and performances have been shown at Tate Modern, at the Venice Biennale, at the Centre Pompidou, at the Palais de Tokyo, Lafayette Anticipations in Paris, the Baltic Triennial, Manifesta 12, and many other venues, including Chisenhale Gallery in London. I'm also joined by Ned McConnell, who is based in London, and Ned is the curator at the Roberts Institute of Art, where he and the team work to deliver a programme of commissioned performance art collaborations with national partners on exhibitions to work and research the collection of David and Indra Roberts. And previous to that, Ned was the curator at the Pump House Gallery in Battersea Park in London, where he spent 5 years developing a programme of exhibitions, events and commissions for outdoor spaces in the park, as well as inside the Grade 2 listed building. So Lauren A. Wright has recently been appointed as Head of Programmes for Metroland Cultures, a new endeavour to develop a cultural activity in Brent and the Brent Biennial, following on from the 2020 Borough of Culture programme. Formerly, Lauren was the programme director at the Siobhan Davies Dance, where she initiated the continuous programme to commission and tour dance in visual arts context, and we'll hear a little bit more about that from Lauren in this session. We're also delighted to be joined by Zinzi Minott, whose work as a performer focuses on the relationship between dance, bodies, and politics. Zinzi explores how dance is perceived through the prisms of race, queer culture, gender, and class, and she's specifically interested in the place of black women's bodies within the form. And Zinzi was also involved working with Lauren as one of the first artists in the continuous programme. And again, we'll hear from Zinzi on this too, but Zinzi has been involved in various organisations and arts-run initiatives as well, and we'll hear a little bit about that. So thank you so much to all my panel, and I'm delighted to start this off. And I will first ask Ned if you can say a little bit more about the work over the past couple of years now with the Roberts Institute of Art and with us here at Glasgow International to show the work of Paul and also the other artists that we have on the online programme. Over to you, Ned.
Sure. Thanks for the invitation. So the Roberts Institute of Art, as you say, formerly known as DRAF, or David Roberts Art Foundation, and we have begun a new direction over the past 4 years, I suppose, but sort of made official by our rebrand recently. We have been championing performance since around 2007 when DRAF was first founded, and that's been a real key factor of our programme. So that's something that we have always wanted to continue with, and I think this year we've certainly tried to find ways to support performance and keep it up the agenda and as a talking point. We've done that in a number of ways. One, obviously, Richard working here in Glasgow and developing the work with Paul and with Nina Bayer and also Lina Lapaleti, whose work is being presented as part of your digital programme. I think one thing that we're very keen to think about over the past year is how does performance present itself when in real life situations are much harder to manifest. So we've been thinking through what it means for an audience to view a performance when they're not in the room with the body, and trying to maintain some of the kind of contingent and surprising elements that are a feature of so much performance. We have also, later this year, we'll be presenting some live art commissions, which really came out of the kind of pandemic situation and so many artists having performance work cancelled or postponed. So we set up a fund for 6 artists that has really looked to support them over a longer period of time to develop new work. And that one will not have such a feature online because we really want that one to be a kind of celebratory moment of coming out of the pandemic. I think that one thing around performance that is difficult to or tricky to manage online is the fact that the control that audiences often have in terms of how they view the work, pressing play and it being confined to a kind of frame, often a video frame, for example, is something we've looked to kind of unpack a bit. And certainly Lina Lapaleti and Nina Bayer's work will be doing that online through surprising ways. I'm not going to spoil it, but you'll be able to see that when you go on the digital website. Mm-hmm. And Paul's work we obviously had on Thursday to a kind of limited audience, but still a fairly significant amount of people and bodies in a room, is also being presented online through a performance to camera that we filmed in the space in the past week. Yeah, I guess I'll leave it there and we can talk more about lots of other things.
Thanks very much, Ned. That's really great to hear. And Paul, I'm just gonna, before I hand over to, I have to say it. It was, such a moving moment when you came out onto the stage in SWG3, the venue where you were performing here. And I think for everybody in the room, probably including you, that was the first performance to have been experienced for over a year, and it just was, obviously in these times there's a limited number of people that can be in it, but just a very powerful thing, and such a reminder of what performance can do. So it's firstly to say a massive thanks to that. And maybe to start with you, to say a little bit about that work and the past year. And I remember right at the start of this year, that you kind of wrote about this. And I think for many of us who've been kind of organising in working with contemporary art, that performance is the thing that's been hardest, certainly from a festival perspective. But do you want to talk a little bit about the performance that you gave the other day?
Yes, sure. Well, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for holding that space for me as well. because it was a very, very charged moment in terms of what the work is about, but also, as you said, like it had been over a year and a half that I didn't perform for an audience. So it was definitely like the nerves were very, very, very high. I mean, the emotions were running very, very high. But as you said, it was also like a beautiful reminder of why I declined all the invitation that came my way last year to perform online for the screen, because it was not necessarily what I thought was going to help performance artists to actually sustain a living and survive through the pandemic, um, because it was still based and ingrained in this logic of like the kind of like gig-based economy. So where you have the feeling to establish a certain like economic stability, but then if something goes wrong, if you are injured, if there's no safety net. And that's why I felt compelled to write last year at the beginning of the pandemic, out of a moment of panic, I have to say, because I didn't know how I would be able to afford my rent and other expenses without being present in a space for people to see. But then in the end, it's kind of like through other ways, like fellowships, other ways that institutions have kind of developed in order to support artists, that it's not necessarily based on the idea of visibility, which I think is incredibly important. Um, that I've been able to actually reset and create this work that um, as had a function in my personal life it was kind of like part of a healing process. So the work is called Taboo du Rag, and it's embedded in a thinking around those two very big and overtly used words like resilience and vulnerability, and what it actually means to access a space of vulnerability and having to be resilient um, as a Black person in the context of sexual abuse. And so a very, very heavy work, which kind of that I've used as a way to kind of give weight to my voice, as a way to understand as well how I could be understanding myself as a victim when throughout centuries, Black men have been portrayed as sexual predator. And so in conversation with Ned, I mean, there were two possible works actually, and that we could present at Glasgow International. And in the end, we presented this one. So I think it was very important for me to have like an in-depth conversation and with the curator, Ned and Lucy, who helped with the production, as well as Kate, the director of Roberts Institute of Art. And I think like it kind of like further um, put the emphasis on the importance of the meaning of curating and curating bodies, when it means to take care and accommodate a body in a space, a narrative as well, what comes with it. And what was interesting is that the venue SWG3, sorry, really hard to say for me, um, is a massive warehouse. So it has the potential to feel quite intimidating, but then I think thanks to the system of the bubbles that were a bit like, that could have been awkward, actually it created something that produced a lot of intimacy in a space that didn't necessarily call for that. Um, I don't know if I responded to your question, but that would be it for now.
That's really great, Paul. And I should also say one of the things that we've got an elaborate setup here, but there is sometimes a bit of a delay between what is said and at one end of the phone line, as it were, and then at the other. So just to kind of mention that to people. But thank you so much, Paul. That was really, I think for me that is going to be one of the like defining moments of this festival, that performance, like coming back into a space. And I really felt that, you kind of alluded to it there, but there was a very simple kind of square that was marked out in the space, and then these very simple kind of red squares where there were kind of bubbles for the audience member, and it was a very pared down setup, but somehow all of that added to the charge of what Paul was communicating about, which as he's explained was very moving. So thank you again. Right, what I'm going to do now is move on to Lauren to talk about the continuous project, and then we'll come to Zinzi as well. So Lauren, if you could talk about that and your work with Siobhan Davis, that'd be brilliant.
Yeah. So up until recently, I was the program director at Siobhan Davis Dance, and the Continuous Network is an ongoing collaboration that still exists between Siobhan Davis Dance, Baltic, Nottingham Contemporary, Tramway, Turner Contemporary, Blue Coat, and the Tetley, along with Dance 4 and Yorkshire Dance. And it was originally established between Siobhan Davis Dance and Baltic, and Siobhan Davis had herself been making work in galleries for about 10 years when we started the conversation, and actually it was initiated here in Glasgow. Siobhan Davis Dance was performing a work here at Tramway, and Sarah Monroe, who had been the director of visual arts for Glasgow Life and obviously of Tramway, had been here when a previous work of Siobhan Davis had come here. And when she moved to Baltic, she was really, really keen to continue working with dance, having done so here. And also, you know, as the organization Siobhan Davis Dance's work was beginning to transition away from supporting solely Siobhan Davis's work to supporting a wider community of artists, one of the main things that we were really keen to do was to look at how we could support contemporary practice in new contexts, and particularly in the visual arts context. And I think some of what Paul alluded to just now were some of the reasons why we were really keen to support that work. So partly because in the dance kind of infrastructure, there's this sort of very high turnover. You know, works come into theaters for a couple of days, they go out again. They're very much self-produced by artists and their producers rather than by the institutions that are showing them. And so we wanted to develop a more sustained relationship with artists that allowed them to really invest in the spaces that they were working in and in those relationships with curators and with ourselves. And, you know, because of the interest that artists have in really developing those intimate relationships with audiences, developing a more sustained conversation, working in different kinds of spaces. But many artists had the experience of being asked to activate an existing exhibition or do something that was quite short term. So, you know, I mean, of course, all these conversations began in 2017, so it was very much pre-pandemic. You know, the lack of resources and expertise that were present in institutions at that time, despite an interest in performance and in dance, were something that we were really keen to address. So we started working together by commissioning, and the commissioning of Zinzi and also of Lucy Suggett was the sort of first two artists. And we selected those artists by open call, which was quite unusual for a visual arts institution. But the reason for doing that was to allow us to really map the terrain and see what different kinds of artists were interested in working in this context. And also to be able to kind of establish a conversation with Baltic around what kind of work we wanted to produce together. And then the network was established later with support from the Arts Council and the John Ellerman Foundation. So yeah, I mean, we were working very much in a model of co-commissioning amongst the institutions. So the first two works, Zinzi and Lucy, were co-commissions between us and Baltic, and we worked very closely together as organizations to do that. And then there's been a subsequent commission, which is with a group called the Freestylers, and that involves Tramway and Blue Coat, as well as Unlimited. So, you know, we were sort of expanding the circle of commissioners. We were able to premiere Lucy's work in 2019 and to tour it. And we learned a ton from that, and we can sort of discuss some of that later. And then, of course, the pandemic hit, and Zinzi's work was due to premiere in April 2020. Sorry, can anyone remember what date it is? And because that hasn't happened, we ended up having, bless Zinzi, a much longer relationship than we had anticipated. So we've been working, and I'm still involved in the conversations with Zinzi, though I'm no longer at SDD. So we've been working together since 2018, which for a dance artist is a super long relationship with an institution. Yeah. And I mean, you know, a lot of it has been circumstantial, but I think in terms of our relationship as two individual practitioners, it's been a really interesting experience. And we really remained committed to the idea of work in person. So, you know, we could have said, okay, well, we're just going to shift everything online. But that, I mean, you know, of course, we had no idea how long this was all going to go on. But I think we really wanted to preserve that opportunity for artists to encounter the work in person. So, you know, we're still working toward that aim. We hope to premiere Zinzi's work later this year. I think, you know, there's been a lot of learning around what it takes to sustain those conversations, and particularly around resourcing. We were fortunate to have some Arts Council funds that we could repurpose, but, you know, those don't last forever. So, so yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there's been a level of organizational commitment that's made that possible, but it's been very much down to Zinzi and Zinzi's willingness to continue those conversations throughout. So yeah, and then there are a number of other artists who are also waiting in the wings. So, you know, I really hope that work sees the light of day. I think it will. But we've learned a lot, I think, around, you know, what it takes to maintain these conversations and how demanding that is for artists over time. But, you know, really wanting to preserve the opportunity for them to present the work in the way that they wanted to present it felt super important.
Thank you. That is so so fascinating to hear, and I think it's really interesting what you kind of point to there of like those relationships which you kind of start out with with a sort of certain thing in mind, and then, as you say, with this pandemic, it's kind of thrown those questions open, and as you say, a much longer relationship, and it'd really be interesting to hear a bit more about how that's developed and what that's meant. And maybe this is a good moment to obviously move on to Zinzi and hear from your perspective about the continuous and maybe just sort of broadly, I guess, about your work as both a dancer and also in helping make other dance happen as well.
Yeah, hi. Thank you for having me. And I just want to kind of jump across the screen and say congrats to Paul. It sounds amazing, and I'm really pleased that some liveness is happening. So well done. Yeah, I mean, it's listening to Lauren talk about the continuous network. It's a bit like This Is Your Life, and hearing this like flashback of so many years of really hard work and getting through the pandemic. Not only, of course, all of us being lucky enough to survive it, but also the work as an idea still surviving, and still being trying to get it to a point of liveness, which I think, as well as Paul, for me was why digital just wasn't an option. It was obviously going to become quite gig-like and unreliable, but I think for me personally, but also for the disciplines of dance and liveness, it really felt for me oppositional, and I just couldn't understand how I'd built this practice where, you know, I'm like committed to liveness. I'm like, movement is it. I'm like, don't document my work. You have to be in the room. And I'm really pushing this idea of the transference in the live moment. And all of a sudden I'm on a laptop. And it was really, I was like, this is not great for an artist like me, you know, not just dancers and liveness, but somebody who has really been a purist. It felt like a teaching moment. And I have learned a lot from it. I still don't think that learning for me was digital. And I think another thing to throw into the thing about the continuous network and how Lauren and I had to negotiate it. I also was, it's a bit weird thing to say now, am high risk. I say was, I guess, because I'm vaccinated now. But that became really important because ordinarily I live my life as a very well, pretty seemingly able-bodied, fit and strong performer. And all of a sudden I was instantly very vulnerable. And that meant the possibilities of me being in liveness, the risk, I'm really sorry if you can hear my cat, he's just decided to have a protest. I don't know why. Yeah. Yeah, like the moments where I would talk about where I was at risk on stage are a lot more to do with the perception and the violences that come down on my body because of its race, class, gendered position. And there was this other thing that just came and sat alongside it and made it a different type of unsafe. And that alongside, I guess you could say, like these puritanical, but very emotional thoughts I have about the power of dance and bodies in spaces with other people watching, like that kind of special alchemy meant that the digital just felt like it should be a natural response, but I didn't feel it. I didn't believe it. And so Lauren and I, along with the other partners, spent the last year really trying to, in some ways, wait it out and try to figure out, you know, how long can you plan and replan and keep something real and buoyant and hopeful that it could actually exist. Now things are changing, and whether that's, you know, because the infection rates going down or the vaccinations going up, and our confidence and understanding in the pandemic, we move again to a point of liveness and hope that we get to manifest it. And I think alongside that, I was fortunate enough to get the Jerwood Live Art Award, where I'm spending a lot of time thinking about liveness and what it means to try and persevere with liveness in this moment. And I think, you know, I'm always very grateful to Jerwood and the kind of thinking that they do about how they hold space for performers. And I think they were very clever to hold out and wait until they had something for live artists. And I'm extremely lucky and privileged to be supported in that way. And I guess in relation to your other question about my work in initiating spaces, I guess it's shifted as my career has gone on. Kind of fortuitously, Paul and I created a space called the Rebel Man Standard, along with Jamila and Hamish, Jamila Johnson Small and Hamish McPherson. And that was a space that came essentially, which I think is useful for the purpose of this conversation. It was created because we the three of us were put in a position of competition. So we'd all received an invitation to go and dance in Vienna for a month, but we were only 50% funded. And the way the award worked, you were supposed to go to your art institution, because it was a global award and people came from all over the world to dance. You were supposed to go to, in our case, what would have been the Arts Council and ask for 50% match funding. When we found out that the three of us had gotten this same opportunity, we pretty much knew or presumed only one of us would be selected. And we had a conversation, we were just like, this is crap. And you know, I didn't know Hamish very much at that point, but Jamila and I were quite close at the time. And it was just like, I don't want to compete with my friend. I love you. I want you to succeed. I want you to exist. And Jamila knew Hamish. So we came together and we were like, we're going to apply to the Arts Council and we're going to tell them, if you want anybody from the UK to be going, you're going to send us all. And we kind of just, I was bricking it. I was really nervous, actually. I was just like, this is bold. Is it going to work? Luckily, I'm still here, and it did. And so the three of us went, and the Rebel Man Standard became a space that we held for 6 months, that started off with us going to Vienna and then coming back and creating a festival where we all invited artists and we held workshops and so on and so forth. And one of the artists that were invited was Paul. And that was, correct me if I'm wrong, your first public performance.
Yes.
Is that right?
Ever.
Yeah, ever. So I guess in terms of like what artists can do for each other, that's it, I guess. is we can create space and hold space for each other and encourage. And I think also and I have to be fair and say, at the time I didn't know Paul. It was Jamila who knew Paul, and when we were deciding who was coming, she was like, I know this guy called Paul, what do you think? And we were like, yeah, sick, bring him on. But one of the things that I think artists do well, that sometimes institutions, because they have other agendas, often agendas that feel cross-purpose to ours, is we see things that aren't about audiences and profit and I don't know, all these things like magical talent and these things that, can be there, but also might not be. But that's not the purpose of being a body in space, right? Like, and I think we take risk, and admittedly, maybe some of the risks that we take with each other don't have the same consequences if you're an institution. Like if I bring someone into a space to dance with me and it isn't quote unquote successful, whatever that means, I'm not going to lose funding. I'm not going to get a bad review always if it's like an artist initiated space. So I think there's something about that allows us to do it as well. We want each other to be risky. We want each other to feel entitled to disciplines we haven't trained in. I think that's also something that we encourage for each other as much as I think that was encouraged for Paul. I have artists who went to art school who encouraged me to be a body in space in the gallery or to make a film. And I think that's something that we do for each other. And the last thing I'll say quickly about the continuous network, because the piece I'm making involves a lot of other artists, one of the things that was really important and that I learned about the pandemic is because I was an artist asking other artists to do something, I literally had the power to pay people. And when lockdown happened and I lost so much work in 3 days, I think you can hear from my voice, like, I think if any of us look back to that time, it's terrifying. But I lost so much work in 3 days. And when Lauren and I sat down on the 11th of March, and I was like, we have to pay everybody. And I could, because my name was on the grant. And that, I think, is a big learning curve for me, because I became one of the few people who were paying people when big institutions, of names I won't mention, didn't until April or May, when we had all screamed on the internet about how cruel this was. So I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Thank you, Zinzi. It's so kind of powerful to hear that account, and the things that have been kind of sticking with me as you were talking there was what you were saying about holding the space and a body in space, and that thing about holding the space, particularly when the world flipped upside down and you had to really get to what is the root of what I'm doing. Everyone asking that question, what's the root of what I'm doing? And basically making that call and being, okay, performance is performance. It is about bodies in the space, and that's it. And we're going to hold with that. And I think it's so powerful to hear that. And also what you were saying there about this kind of thing of supporting each other and basically working collaboratively, because I think, and that feels to me, or in terms of learning from the pandemic, something that is really there for organizations as well, in terms of like, okay, what we're doing here, it's not necessarily about who's got something first or something like that. It's about maybe there's a space, I don't know, I'm just spouting my learning maybe here, but like, how can we work together collaboratively with organizations to do that, to be supportive and work to that kind of bigger thing of really what it's all about, which is that bodies in space, holding the space thing. And yeah, anyway, that's just my response, I guess, to that. But thank you so much. So maybe what would be good is to probe a little bit more, maybe with Lauren and Zinzi about that kind of. I don't know how comfortable you feel about talking about how the evolution of that work. Obviously, we've got the a little bit there about just the supporting of people. But do you want to talk a little bit more about how you're working and the sort of where you started out and how that kind of evolved?
I mean, I think Zinzi's been very committed to the shape of the work, and we've not actually mentioned that, so maybe Zinzi can talk about it in more detail, but suffice it to say, it involves a huge amount of preparation for Zinzi. So it's a very, very physical work and requires like months of preparation. So I think, in some ways it feels like the work has become that preparation, and Zinzi maintaining the space to be able to carry on doing that, and also us trying to resource that, because the support required for that is fairly substantial. I think it's been really interesting to see how, in particular, Zinzi has been able to maintain the focus. And the idea is something that has been around for a really long time, and so I think it feels like it's got an integrity. We are thinking about, how does the work become sustainable over time? How can other people take it on so that it's not just Zinzi's body who performs it? But a lot of this is very much down to the circumstances that the work finds itself in the future. But I think the main thing is that a work of this scale would be very difficult without collaboration. So I think that was one of the things that, from the very beginning, we were really conscious of. And, even with the level of collaboration that we had, we still needed additional support. So I think that's the thing that's really important. And it sounds like with Paul's work as well, when institutions come together to share resources, then you can get a lot more done. And, one of the fears that I have is that, in particular with performance, there's a recognition that resourcing it well, it's expensive. It takes quite a bit of resource, it takes time, it takes, expertise. And I have a real concern about institutions kind of going, oh, well, that's a kind of nice to have. So I think the collaborations are what's really going to make it possible for that to happen. Because, I think, one of the things that I'm sort of concerned about, we had a huge amount of investment to do this program. And of course, eventually it will become visible. But it's going to be a sort of delayed satisfaction. And I hope that it's not too late for people to see the value of what we're doing.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lauren. That's really, really interesting to hear. And I don't know, Zinzi, if you want to kind of talk a little bit more about, the shaping of the work from your side. Yeah.
Yeah. So Black on Black, as it's currently known, because I do have a tendency of changing the names of my work as they leave me, basically. But Black on Black is a work that I wanted to make when I graduated Laban. I actually created, designed, and conceptualized the work in Liverpool 6 months after I graduated, within the first 6 months that I graduated, and quite naively, I'm still glad I did it, but quite naively set about trying to fundraise for a 24-hour performance as a graduate who knew. And I applied for all of the big names, and obviously they were all good. I say obviously because this is how it works. And now I understand I would never have received that funding as a graduate. But at the time, you don't know what you don't know. And sometimes that works in your favor and sometimes it doesn't. And I realized that a work that I want to perform, I was committed and interested in the idea that the body is an archive and that I don't have to conceptualize the archive, document the body, put it in a box, make it tangible in order for the archive to exist, but that I can be and live and breathe and be a physical archive, and that I am. And I wanted to collect what we can call artifacts from different dancers. So the pieces that I collect, and different artists donate a minute of movement to me. And I lay them all out until we get to 60 minutes. And then I perform that 60 minutes 24 times. So that becomes a day's worth of work. And when I left Laban, I made a very clear decision that I wouldn't dance for free, which seems maybe small, but as a working class dancer, as a Black dancer, it was just not feasible for me, I did not have the financial backing of some of my peers to dance for free. All of the free internships were not going to be possible. And so I had to commit to that. And that became also a commitment to pay dancers. When you look at a work like that, when you pay people a living wage for a work like that, that piece of work, to work with 30 people is astronomical in terms of how we consider funding in the arts. And I do think that I agree with Lauren that one of the main issues and why I was attracted to this particular commission, and I remember the person who sent me the call was Beverly Bennett, and she said, this is it. You're always talking about, you have to apply for this, is the understanding that dance and bodies and live work are expensive and you need to pay them. You need to resource them. And that has been a real struggle, I think, for dancers and performance artists within like a gallery setting, is trying to having to justify your value and your resources that you need to make the work. And I think what Lauren is pointing to is to train for a work where I dance for 24 hours safely. And when, because obviously, sorry, I've got to go back. When I wanted to make the work over 10 years ago, couldn't get the funding. This commission came, Lauren and the team said, give us your blue sky. So I was like, all right, this is the blue sky. And everybody kind of cleared their throat. But they were excited, but we had to clear our throat because even actually the resources on the table, it became very clear, were not enough. And everybody starts, creating a new arts council budget essentially. And here we are. But the training that is needed to safely do this type of work, which is what was really important to me. So I was like, I need a physio, something that dancers are not allowed to say. I need to train, I need to eat, I need to go to the gym. I don't want to break my leg doing this performance, which I think is actually usually what's expected of us. Throw your body in and your friends will clear up the mess after the applause. And that's what generally happens. So to make the demands to do this work safely and for that to be listened to actually meant even for the continuous network, there had to be an adjustment. And it was, it was a learning curve for me to say, this is going to be hard. So throughout the pandemic, I think we are now on our 4th possible performance date, which means I have been training and not training and training again to perform for a day since 2018. It's a lot. Paul's eyes were like,
it's commitment.
Yeah. Show us the biceps.
That's become the practice.
The biceps left me in lockdown, so I'm trying to call them back. They're not picking up the phone right now. I think they'll start answering soon. But yeah, it's the making of the work has become the work for sure.
Yeah.
And it's not, I think it's like
thank you. That's so. That's
the delay. Sorry. No, I just wanted to say that I think it's like it's quite so interesting to think about, and I'm quite concerned with this question of like, how do you show a practice as well, instead of like showing something that necessarily has to be like finalized or has a certain shape. And I think it's super interesting in the process that you described, Zinzi. It's like it's about the practice. It's about like in the end, what you are going to show is a practice and several practices actually. Yeah. I find that like really interesting in terms of like visibility and also expectations of, the institution sometimes have a certain expectation of what a performance look like or what it is. And often that's where the hurts come in, because it's kind of like, it's cutting the actual work from its preparation, from what comes after, for what comes before, and you never see that, I think, or you never, in the art world especially, I think there's this tendency of focusing on the outcome, or what people call the outcome, but then the performance without the before and without the after doesn't really necessarily make sense. And I think it's also something to think about in terms of like support in general.
I think this is where like, sorry, the delay. I think this is where like the visual arts, there's learning for the artwork, for the visual arts world to learn from the dance world, and the dance world to learn from the visual arts. I don't think it's one way at all. But what the dance world does do well is most of the work is preparation. And that's where my training is. You know, my training is not in fine art, my training is in dance, and being in a ballet studio and being invisible and constantly saying, sorry, I can't because I've got rehearsals. And then there's these 3 nights where everybody understands why I've been absent, you know, and then you disappear again. And so actually being in that process whilst being situated in the visual art world more regularly, it's also been a check for the ego. And I agree about this word you use, visibility, because actually no one's been able to see what I've been doing. And I've just been, from I got the commission until now, what I've been doing has been mostly invisible to, let's say, anybody who may be audience at the end of the year. And that for me is very familiar from my training space. But whilst working in the visual arts, people are like, oh, so what are you doing? I'm just like, pliés, sit-ups, rehearsals.
That's so, it's so, I think what you were sort of touching on there about the differences between like the dance world and then the art world, because I think often, you know, obviously arts organisations are small, they're often not very well, I mean, you know, resources are thin on the ground in many respects. And I guess also what you sometimes have in this regard is, say, like curators who've been working for a long time or have a particular knowledge in terms of like putting up exhibitions of physical artworks. And that's a kind of way of approaching things that involves like loans and or like here's a new piece that's built on site, and then it goes up, and then, you know, the curtain is raised, if you like, and the audience go in, and that's a kind of different way of thinking. And I think what's such a really powerful reminder of what you're talking about here is the kind of needs of performers and like the sort of before and after care, basically, of that. And that's really, I think, so important to for us to think on as visual arts organisations. And I guess, so thank you for that. And one of the things that I'm really just picking up a lot, or just reflecting on, I guess, is this thing about collaboration, because, as you said, it's not cheap. It's a real investment, and it is hard for arts organisations, because obviously, I mean, like freelancers, artists have suffered a lot, and also so have many arts organisations as well have lost money. So it's a difficult time, and I think that this that what you're saying about collaboration and partnership is just so important to make these things happen in the way that they should. And for instance, Paul's performance, you know, we couldn't have done that without not only the Roberts Art Institute, Institute of Art, but also the venue, SWG3, providing that venue, support on the ground as well. And it really is this kind of mix of lots of things. And I also have to say, a big, you know, have to mention in a big way, funders, certain funders who've really stuck with it and have kind of understood the ongoing needs. You know, the Art Fund is a good example for us, but there are others as well. Paul Hamlin Foundation have come in, but I think it's those artists who've maybe, funders who've started on a journey and then realised in the midst of this how the world has changed and have kind of adapted as well, and that does need to be said too, because it's all of those things, and it's also nice as well from an institutional perspective, if you like, to hear, Zinzi, your kind of reflection, understanding that institutions have lots of different, often competing demands as well, and are trying to do all these different things to sort of accommodate different what is sometimes called stakeholders for us, I guess, and that is important as well to understand too. So yeah, definitely. But thank you, and maybe come back to Ned as well, and talk about because it is interesting. You've stuck the course in, and kind of, it's, as I said, so wonderful to have had Paul's performance come out, and to have Paul up here in Glasgow. But you have also done the online projects as well, and I think it's worth noting that both of those artists are neither of them are based in the UK, and they've also taken a leap in a different direction. But I guess maybe it is interesting to hear about that as well. So
yeah, I think one of the things that we've certainly tried to do over the course of the pandemic is try to maybe be a bit more proactive about decision making. So it was very useful, Richard, that GI had set a date that you were going to do the festival quite early on. All of that stuff makes planning and everything, and even conversations with artists, much easier. No matter how things become reorganised or shift over that time, you at least know what the end game is and what you're aiming for. Obviously, Nina and Lena are not based in the UK, so quite early on we decided that an in real life performance was not going to be possible. But we've tried to, we've spent a lot of time kind of upskilling ourselves. We don't have a particular history of working in kind of digital online spaces, but I do think that, just trying to take a step back and think through what are the sort of performative elements that exist online and trying to utilize those things in the making of the work. We've worked with your web developers quite closely and had conversations between them and the artists about what is possible, what the frame is, because I think when you look at an online space, it's quite a sort of amorphous, blobby thing that you don't really understand. And from a commissioning point of view, I think that one of the things you often bring with you when you're talking to artists is a really good understanding of the context that you're commissioning into. So I think it was really important for us to start to learn more about what that context is when you're talking about being online, because it is such a big, strange space. Just to go back to the collaboration thing and Paul's performance particularly, totally echo your thoughts about SWG3. They were brilliant, and it's a really good example, I think, of where collaboration can make everything much stronger, because they've invested so much infrastructure into kind of COVID-safe regulations that we were able to have really good, open, honest conversations about the type of event we wanted, the type of feeling we wanted, and then they were able to guide us in terms of what that would look like. And I think in the end, it produced something which felt like a very collective, special moment, but that also felt very safe for people. Glasgow in particular is only just coming out of a very long lockdown. Inevitably, people are quite anxious about that. Social situations are very strange and can be quite overwhelming. And I think it actually felt very safe, which was super important to us.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that is worth reflecting on is that obviously when you started having the conversations with Paul, we were expecting that space to hold like maybe 2,000 people, right? And then actually, in terms of COVID, the maximum number we could have in that space was 100. So it is very different, and that, we need to remark that you can't, not everyone is going, it's just a smaller audience. It is limited in those respects, and for many organisations, it is going to be financially very difficult because of ticket sales and all those very basic things. So I think it is just recognising, I suppose, the fortunate situation that we were in to be able to even do that. But I know that for everyone I've spoken to who was in that room, what a powerful thing it was. And as you say, just that, as has been said, I suppose that what performance bodies in the room does in particular, and why that's powerful to hold on to, important to hold on to.
Just on that as well, because I think the nature of the performance as well, Paul's performance, and the kind of very intimate nature of it also played into that. The fact that it was a slightly smaller audience, I don't know, it would have felt very different, and Paul, maybe you can talk a bit about this as well, if there was 2,000 people in that room watching, a very, very quiet, very, very subtle performance,
Yes.
Yeah, I think in the end,
And because
the context also, made the work become something else, or maybe it wouldn't have been able to exist in this way, and I'm not even sure I would have felt comfortable performing it for 2,000 people, for example. I mean, I think I would have probably not thought of that performance for that space. But what was nice to see is that you could still have, yeah, again, a sense of like of a crowd, but without feeling that you are in danger, or yeah, you could be safe, because that's also another aspect of the pandemic, and especially in the visual art, where at the beginning I had the feeling that some people didn't really believe in the pandemic, in the risk that it meant for artists to take a plane and to travel to install a show. Like I had to say no to curators who were being very, very authoritarian about certain decisions, and then sometimes I felt like I was being like, portrayed as like this paranoid person, or not willing to take part in the show, not grateful enough, when actually for me my responsibility was to alert them that what was the risk like for a group of 10 artists to travel to a country, and what it entailed for even for like the technical team there, like what were the parameters in place in order to ensure that everybody felt safe. And then yeah, like most of the people didn't even respond to me, and so at some point I was just like, okay, I'm going to make the decision for myself that I won't be traveling. And so that was, I think, again, to go back to this idea of collaboration, the expertise of SWG3 being a venue that accommodates like mostly, like club nights or concerts. There's an expertise there that maybe like some art venues wouldn't have, in terms of accommodating an audience, in terms of health and safety, like, but for other reasons. And I think it was really great to see that they came up with a system that felt, from what I've heard also from different members of the audience, that felt like very nice, and could also make the work exist in a way that it didn't feel that it was restricted by the restrictions.
Yeah, no,
I think
absolutely.
this
Zinzi,
word
go
you're
for it.
using, collaboration. Thank you, collaboration. I think the flip side of that word, I think in our context, our working context, is authority. And I think often arts institutions can have a relationship to us as artists that is paternalistic and authoritarian, which means that at the moment, when the pandemic happened and we were saying, no, we don't want to go, we don't think it's safe to go, we weren't listened to, because actually we were in an authoritarian relationship. We weren't in a collaborative relationship. And I say that because I did actually see the difference between sitting down with Lauren and Arini from Baltic and Kate at the time, before the original lockdown had even been announced. And I was just kind of hearing chatter, I say chatter like I'm in MI5, from my friends in the States. And my friend was already saying, Zinzi, don't go outside. And I'd said to Lauren, I think we might have to start talking about this. I'm getting nervous. And they sat down with me and they had a real conversation. I wasn't treated as if I was paranoid, even though we didn't all know even what we learned in the next week when the lockdown actually happened. But other institutions, I had the experience a lot more like Paul, where it was kind of like, what's your problem? There's no lockdown. And it meant, yeah, it cost a lot of energy and money. Like, we all lost money and time. Whereas I think collaboration means that you respect the other person's opinion, even if you don't understand where it's coming from. When somebody says to you, I am too scared to travel, to do the show, even if they are paranoid, that's still really important. Like, it's important that your artist is too scared to work. And that doesn't matter whether there is a pandemic outside or it's in their head. What we weren't listened to. And that care isn't just about the pandemic being real, it's about wanting to make sure that your artists are in the best state internally and externally to do their work. and it seems like that was forgotten, but could be
Yeah, I mean, I think,
remembered through that. Go ahead.
sorry, the delay. I think this word care has become such a buzzword, and I'm really concerned about how it becomes like something that we don't forget. Because I think the circumstances that Zinzi and Paul are pointing to of artists having needs, and sometimes those needs are in contradiction to the needs of the institution, that's always been present. There was a very clear global context that perhaps is, eventually became different. But I think, I'll be really curious to see, for example, well, both through Continuous and also your project, how this becomes something that we can kind of really make concrete. Because one of the things that we ended up doing over this period of time in Continuous was have a lot of conversations with the partners about what that means and what our sort of commitments needed to be as a group of institutions. And, I think we all have a responsibility to keep that at the front of our agendas, even if there isn't like a crazy global pandemic. So, but I think it's something that, it's expensive. Sometimes you have things that don't happen, or that, artists have more access needs than you might have thought of, or, there's all sorts. So I'm just very curious to see whether that's something that we can maintain as professionals and, listening to what the artists' needs are.
Yeah.
They've always been there.
No, 100%. And I think one of the things that, in terms of the festival, that about the pandemic, this is going to sound a bit weird, but I think it's like often when you're organising a big show or a festival instance, there's so many things that happen behind the scenes that you don't see as an audience member, and all the challenges basically that you're overcoming, and a lot of that is, there's a lot of work, I suppose, that goes into sort of hiding that, so that people don't see it. The thing about the pandemic is that it's like everybody, it was much, certainly as things got on, it was just very clear to everybody that like this is the situation that we're all in. And that there's something about that in this which is kind of important, because everybody could understand that it's like, okay, it's not happening this time, and that's why. I think it's kind of that links to what you were just saying, Lauren, for me in a way, about what will happen next. But it does kind of a really important question. Okay, we have got a facility to get questions from the audience as well. So really keen to do that. And if anyone's got some questions, fire them over. I've got a kind of snappy iPad thing in front of me, which apparently is going to have questions coming through. So I'm going to hopefully be able to sort of read those and pass them on. And I've already got some things that are coming in. So I'm just going to, I don't have names to these, so I can't read, but I'm just going to read them out, and you'll know because you wrote them. Okay, so I've got the top question here is, what do you think the main difference is between the performing arts, i.e. live art, and performance in a visual arts context? That's a massive question. And maybe I'm going to put that to Zinzi, because maybe as someone who's come from a dancing background, it'd be interesting to hear.
I'm gonna carve the answer in two. I think that institutionally, maybe the main difference is that I started taking ballet when I was 3. So I often say, dance is the longest relationship I've ever had. It is genuinely the first love of my life, and it exists in me, and it has literally shaped my bones in a very serious way. And that is part of the work and the practice. I think as a dancer who makes dance works and has also been in performance art, I think that for me, the difference is the length of the journey in my body, and that dance is really my training. It is my language, and it's the way I see things, which might not necessarily always be the case for me. I think I see performance art through a dance lens. I think it's my filter, it's my viewing filter. And I think, so that's bodily. I think ideologically, and this is something that I think I've also heard Lauren say, that the dance world can think that it is somehow achieve some pinnacle of reflection because it works with this universal tool, which is the body, which is just fundamentally not true. It is just as problematic a space, maybe in fact more, because it thinks that, as any other space. I think the visual arts world has a lot of problems, sometimes as similar to the dance world, but there are actual conversations happening, whereas I think dance leans too much into the silence when it comes to hard conversations. Because we're body based, people won't speak about things that need to be spoken about, like racism, ableism, funding, discrimination, sexual assaults. Like, people just literally will not speak or let people speak. Whereas I think, as much as those problems all exist in the visual arts world, speaking in of itself is not in opposition to the form. Whereas I think in dance, people think it's in opposition to the form. And yeah, it's like a PhD.
Thank you. That's really, yeah, thank you. That you've summed up a PhD very well. Yeah. Thank you so much. So I've got another question here, which is, as we start to go back into the world of being in person, what are the things that you've learned from lockdown that you wouldn't want to return to? I'm going to put this question to Ned.
Well, I think that one thing that we've been doing for a while, because we don't have our own space, we previously did, but now that's to focus our energy on collaboration, I suppose. And one thing that is important to us is working with spaces that are better equipped to produce performance work, so places like SWG3. And I think gallery spaces can be very interesting for performance, but they're also very problematic on a production and practical level, you know. So I think that's one thing that we will probably do less of. I think thinking through the idea of large-scale celebratory big one-night events is something that we will probably move away from, and think about more things over time, or slightly quieter, maybe more reflective spaces for performance. Because I think the world is, the world is obviously not the same as it was 10 years ago, and that idea of big kind of parties and things around performance, I think, is less relevant now. There's very serious questions to be asked around bodies and performance and things, and I think that kind of big those big celebrations are maybe not so appropriate.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. Having just launched the festival, it is, you know, and obviously no previews this year, and none of that, and it is a different thing, and there is a sort of like, well, maybe people will be looking more at the exhibitions, who knows? But that said, there is something about, because we've obviously been reflecting here about what makes a festival. Why is a festival a thing? Why is that important? And obviously, one of the things that it does is that it's a moment, and it's this kind of aggregation of stuff around a moment that is something that's important. And there is something interesting about how that relates to performance. And I guess, obviously, you know, this the performance network, and there's a question about that, so I'll come back to that later. The starting point for this conversation is 3 festivals, basically, and how performance relates to that. So I kind of feel there is something important about this, what these generative moments can bring in terms of performance, and how those 2 things can have can sort of help each other in some respects, is what I would say. And just to kind of following on from that, this question of, you know, what do you see the future of the performance network looking like? Well, that is a big question. And I think one of the things that is coming out for me is, and we've talked about it a bit already, and Zinzi talked about this from an artist's perspective, but this question of collaboration and partnership is really important. And I think that's both partnerships in terms of what happens within one festival context. So, as you say, the venue, also an organisation like yourself, Roberts Arts Institute of Art. But maybe it's also thinking across the different festivals as well, and thinking about that, and other internationally, about other organisations wanting to work with artists, and how we can kind of pool resources and things like that. But because that is, I think, a very fundamental and big question, basically, because as we're hearing, it's not cheap. I'm getting 2 minutes sign from a wonderful team here. So now then, what else have we got here? Okay, so this question, what strategies, in addition to collaboration, can we deploy to address Lauren's fear that performance doesn't take on a nice-to-have status for institutions? So what strategies can we deploy to avoid this nice-to-have status? That's interesting. I'm going to ask Lauren that question, and then I'm also going to ask artists.
I mean, I think it's about investment, fundamentally, and commitment. I think it's something that, just from my experience, for example, of like Lucy Suggett's performance, the amount of audience enthusiasm is extraordinary. And those moments of contact are really important, and they require investment. So I think it's recognizing that you will get a payback, a sort of institutional payback in terms of audience engagement. And also the kind of learning that the institution will do around the work and the kind of breadth of practices that the institutions can support. So I think, I do think, it has to be a commitment alongside the other commitments, fundamentally.
Yeah. And actually, maybe just an inflection on that. Thank you very much, Lauren. And maybe just to Lauren and Paul, I guess any final sort of reflections, after this year and where you're at after these different kind of collaborations and partnerships, and just the point at which you're at now, basically. If you have anything you want to add.
I would say consistency.
I
would say, thank you. I would say consistency is key here. The one thing that the pandemic has taught us is like this kind of real, I've forgotten the word now. It was something to get through, right? And there were all these statements that we made about what was going to happen, what we were going to do, all these things we were going to fight and make better. I think the best example of that is the Black Square. And already a year later, the figures have shown, it's not just my experience, it's the figures have shown, actually racism has gone up. Black and brown artists are more unhappy than ever. There is a lack of consistency, and that's not just about race, that's about performance, that's about other marginal people, marginal work, marginal experiences. I think we need to be consistent about whether that's about marginal work within our industry, like dance, within a visual arts context, or about marginal experiences. We just need to not overpromise, we just need to promise what we can do, and we need to be consistent with it. And then we can develop from there. I think I'd like that.
Yeah, I would totally second that, and also maybe more work in terms of acknowledging that we are all in on it, and so this is a collective effort, and maybe like this collective effort also demands from the institution to bring in artists as consultants, and paying artists for consultancy and involving them into the process of dismantling those structures that can be oppressive. Absolutely. As well as like producing more care, because care is, as well as what I was talking about, resilience and vulnerability, buzzwords that can be so easy to use, but how do we implement that? How do we generate that? Do we really want that? Sometimes I also doubt that some institutional bodies or power structures really want that, because they know that it's going to fragilize their position. So it's really about that. And I think our common friend, actually, Jamila, said something that was really poignant, is to start to listen, really, and stop to only hear, because listening involves also consequences. There's always consequences in listening that you don't necessarily have in just hearing or receiving the info. It's how do we implement and integrate that into a practice.
Yeah, I agree.
Thank you, Paul. That's and Zinzi and everybody here, actually, Ned, Lauren, really appreciate this conversation, and that's a nice note to end on. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.